Welcome to ESGX Live, the community for information and education to inspire collaboration and action on all things to do with sustainability. With me, Nigel Lake here in New York, and my co-host Paul Herman in France. Coming up, we will have a fascinating discussion about the importance of cultural factors and local preferences in taking action on everything to do with sustainability and ESG, brought to us with some new research by Dr. Marc Sardy and Matej Susec. One of the intriguing and important things here is that so much of what lies ahead in sustainability is in some ways becoming harder. And what I mean is the big steps around climate change to do with decarbonisation of our energy production and of transport and associated areas of industrial decarbonisation may sound like a mountain to climb, but are relatively easy compared to addressing ecological sustainability, where you have to deal at a much smaller scale with local farming systems, let alone, of course, the challenges we have with the fight back against ESG as an idea, which is coming from all sorts of corners, including Florida, where our guests today are based. But before all of that, a couple of things. Just one bit of good news. We've obviously seen the significant acceleration in investment in the energy transition, as reported by Bloomberg New Energy Finance a few weeks ago. Over $1 trillion a year now being invested. And secondly, more recently, I know we've talked on prior episodes about lime and cement and the decarbonisation of that as a hard to decarbonise sector. That is fast becoming easy to decarbonise with the Lilac technology, and now also in partnership with Heirloom, a company backed by, investor's name just slipped my mind, but brings direct air capture within grasp on economic terms in the pretty near future, which is very exciting. But before all of that, let us now dive into this month's Green Jobs Report with Paul Herman and Amir Khaleghi. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Nigel, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on your time zone. Thanks for joining us at ESGX. Today, as Nigel introduced, we have Dr. Marc Sardy and Matej Susec, who are going to share their latest academic research on the role of culture in ESG around the world and the associated financial risks and returns. Before we get there, Amir Khaleghi, who's a PhD candidate at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and an analyst, director at HIP Investor, is going to share the latest Green Jobs Report, which has some updated numbers because there have been some revisions. Amir, can you tell us more about it?
Yes, of course. So this was an exciting month, as Paul had mentioned, with the BLS data, as they had done a large overhaul in terms of revisions for numbers over the past 10 years. This is something that they appear to be doing on a yearly basis, and excited to unpack what resulted from it. So for those of you who are joining us for the first time, this is the monthly Green Jobs Report on ESGX. And on this Green Jobs Report, we provide data-driven insights towards a greener, more sustainable economy. We do that by overlaying human impact plus profit rating data based on 7 HIP pillars of health, wealth, earth, equality, trust, products and services, and management practices, which are all associated to individual companies, over 2,000 in fact. And each of these companies are associated with a industry that's classified by the BLS. So what we do is cross-map this industry data to company data, and then overlay it on the information provided by the current employment statistics survey. Once we do that, once we do the cross mapping, we're able to provide a weighted industry HIP rating that spans from green, slightly extractive, and extractive. Example industries can be found on the bullet points: recycling services, cleaning manufacturers, slightly extractive being insurance agencies, and extractive industries being oil and gas extraction, casinos, and the like. In total, there were 190 industries that were being tracked. Over the course of the revisions, there were some groups that were aggregated smaller groups into larger groups that affected some of the numbers. 20 in total were reabsorbed into other industries. So right now we are analyzing around 170 industries in total. So what we found is that green industries were the fastest to recover from the COVID-19 recession. We can see here that during the COVID-19 spike, that green industries were the least affected in terms of proportional job loss. And they were the first to cross the threshold of their February 2020 level back in November 2021, whereas slightly extractive lagged behind from about 4 months, and then about even 6 to 8 months later, slightly extractive crossing the threshold. Previously, before the revisions, extractive industries were beginning to gain on green industries in terms of the proportional difference from the February 2020 level. With the revision this month, extractive industries have edged green industries in terms of their proportional employment relative to their February 2020 level. Something to be noted is that there are more extractive industries. So when looking at oil and gas extraction specifically, this is the second year in the row that employment numbers were overemphasized for about 20,000 to 35,000 by 35,000 employment. And again, this is due to not only maybe an overestimation on the dependence of these types of industries and the workers that they employ, but also due to the seasonality shift and the availability of being able to work on locations such for oil and gas extraction. So some stylized facts are that from November to December, we saw a positive change of over 270,000. And currently at the December 2022 level, we are at 132.2 million, which is around 2.5 million or so above the February 2020 level. Moreover, jobs in greener industries were more resilient to job loss. We can kind of see this from the unemployment rates. Something to note is that these unemployment rates are taken from a household survey as opposed to a firm level survey as the CES would be. So using this household level data, we find that green industries have an associated unemployment rate of 2%, whereas slightly extractive have an associated unemployment rate of 4%, extractive having a 3.8%, and then the overall economy being at a 3.4% unemployment rate. We can also note that during the spike of COVID-19, that again, green industries were the least affected in terms of job loss. Despite all these facts, we're building back to the same less resilient, less accommodating, people forward types of jobs that can be found in extractive industries. This is indicative of the lowering of the overall HIP employment rate as the unemployment rate lowers as well. So as we are getting less unemployment, the overall HIP rating is lowering, thus indicating that we're building back to more extractive jobs, going further away from a net positive economy. Notably, the economy was at its hippest point during COVID-19, but this was a statistical fact because the more extractive, less resilient, lower HIP rated industries suffered the highest amount of job loss, which then brought up the overall HIP economy rating. In terms of pay, there's a significant difference for greener industries. They pay substantially more. Even with the revision, we were revised down around 500 on average, whereas slightly extractive was revised up by around 1,500 in terms on an annual basis. This is author calculated using factoring average hourly earnings along with average weekly hours over the course of the month
And
into the
Amir,
year.
isn't it, I think part of, some of the observation here too is greener industries are more sustainable. They tend to be safer, whereas these extractive industries, which includes oil, gas, and coal, and I see Rose has asked a question about where the banks are ranking. The banks are mainly in this orange and a little bit in the red category for banks that make loans to extractive industries. But the extractive industries themselves are less safe, more accidents, as you can see, lower pay, and more susceptible to layoffs during crises. So it's it's a super important, if from a policy perspective, and we'll talk about this in a moment with Dr. Sardy and Matej Susec, is how culture and policy can play a role. All right, Amir, how have these changed over time? And then we can.
Glad you asked.
All right.
So for those of you who have followed us over the course of, I believe it's almost 3 years now, 2-3 years now, of the Green Jobs Report, something that is constantly repeated is how green jobs have paid the most and also have very strong wages. Over the course of the past 6 months, there is headlines, as you know, on inflation. And I often wonder to myself, are greener industries causing higher wage inflation? Well, with these revised numbers, we can see that on average, green jobs are on pace with slightly extractive in terms of wage growth and still greatly outpacing extractive industry jobs in terms of wage growth, but not as prominent in terms of wage growth by being greater than slightly extractive by 2 or 3%. We actually see now that they are coupled with one another more closely, but as we can see from this graph, there is still a very significant difference. So, a proportional growth in wage, 5% of 90,000, in absolute amount would be proportionally more in terms of, when taking from 60,000. But regardless of all that, what I'm trying to get at is even with a very strong wage, it is not showing decreased growth in terms of wage. It's on par with slightly extractive, and slightly extractive and green industry wages are above extractive industries. So again, these are I guess economic factors that show up. Maybe we could find these on a balance sheet, but the interesting part is looking at what aspects of these green jobs are not shown on the balance sheet. So when we go back here, when we look at what are the trust factors between employees that managers and are showing between their colleagues, the management practices, what equality is taking place within a company, these types of cultural aspects within a company, the HIP ratings are encapsulating, and then we again overlay it to company data. So with that being said, really excited about the research that is about to be presented that's also using HIP ratings, but in a different but similar way.
Thanks, Amir, and thanks for now 3 years of the Green Jobs Report, which was launched right before COVID. So we're able to track what happened during COVID, how it was built back during COVID. Some built back better, some built back the same. So it's really insightful and can be part of the jobs policymaking going forward. All right, so let's bring bring up Dr. Marc Sardy, professor at Rollins College, who teaches finance and sustainable finance, also teaches in France during the year, and Matej Susec, who will become an MBA this spring, and also has a podcast on impact investing. So we'll put the link to the podcast in the chat, as well as the link to the academic journal, because the latest paper is comparing culture around the world and mapping ESG, or in this case, HIP ratings, to different companies around the world. And Matej and Dr. Sardy are going to share the results of that research and implications. So thanks for joining us here. So Dr. Marc and Matej, how did you come up with this idea? What was the genesis for going down this path?
Well, I think part of what I would add to it is Matej and I were talking about this. He has a genuine interest in ESG, and I was saying, well, Paul had been kind enough to work with us on some of the analytics that I was doing, and I said, well, we have access to this. One of the things that seemed to never get into the research was, how does culture and finance come together? More importantly, how can you connect culture, finance, and ESG, or in this case, HIP, which we found to be much more interesting. Now, I had done a little research with some of the HIP data before that, where I did comparisons between Bloomberg, the data they were collecting on ESG and HIP. And my earlier research paper, which was also published, showed that the HIP ratings were significantly more effective at predicting returns than the Bloomberg ratings were. And they were, ironically, shortly after I had pulled all that together, Bloomberg had at least backed away from doing ESG on their platform. I think they've subsequently resumed, but unfortunately, during that period of time, our school lost access to it. But Paul's been great enough in terms of allowing us to work with it. But I'm going to turn it over to Matej to give you, more insights on the research that we did, and then we'll take it from there.
Absolutely. Let me share my screen. So first, let me just say that we are both very excited to be joining the ESGX community because I think it's very important that there is a platform that inspires collaboration and helps to build a better, more resilient and more inclusive society. And part of this is touched through our research that was recently published in the Academy of Economics and Finance Journal, and it's called How Different ESG Factors Across Cultures Affect Financial Performance. Okay, there we go. So just so you know what to expect from this short presentation, we're going to briefly talk about the research background, which Paul sort of alluded already with his question, but then we're going to make a deep dive into the data, the results, and ultimately concluding with the findings of the research. So firstly, what we were thinking is just the importance of triple bottom line, the people, planet, and the profits, how all of this plays together, and how companies can, through that, establish a competitive advantage on the long term, because making impact on the people they work with, so all stakeholders, but also on the environment, ultimately impacting their bottom line, is very important for their future outlook. And then thirdly was just the sheer investor interest, as seen in the following chart. So this is, for example, from Morningstar, the sustainable funds quarterly flows in the US. And so at the time of the research, when we saw this, we were like, oh, we have to look into this deeper, because there is so much money getting poured into ESG funds and equities at the same time. On the other hand, the debt financing also increased with the opportunities such as green loans, social bonds, and green bonds. And you can see that the numbers here are insane. So just for example, from 2016 to 2021, there has been an almost 10x increase in the opportunities for green financing. Another important thing here to mention is that usually those opportunities for debt financing are cheaper than the regular means of financing, and they also inspire projects that are beneficial for our community and for our environment. So that's a double win. And then thirdly, what sort of steered us to the cultural aspect of ESG and finance was just how different parts of the world are differently invested into ESG. And this is mutual funds and ETFs compared to Europe, China, the US, and the rest of the world. And you can see that over this 5-year snapshot from 2017 to 2021, Europe has been leading the pack with by far the most funds allocated to climate funds. You can see also that the United States were generally in the second place, but in 2021, China actually surpassed them. And part of the whole reason is that the Europe is ahead is perhaps their regulatory environment with upcoming corporate sustainability reporting directive, but already sustainable finance disclosure in the EU taxonomy. Companies are forced to report more, which is also makes it easier for investors to know what they're investing in with all those reports. And so when we did the literature review for our research, we found that many other researchers sort of connected the culture and the ESG. And on the other hand, some of them connected ESG and financial performance. But none of them really took a holistic look and see how culture affects ESG investing and the bottom line, the financial returns of the large companies. And so for that reason, as we already talked about, we were fortunate enough to work with Paul and his team at HIP Investor and use the data for ESG ratings, or essentially HIP ratings. And as you're probably familiar, they are evaluating companies on different pillars such as health, wealth, earth equality, trust, management, and products and services. And this is all together coming into a HIP rating, which is a number between 0 and 100, 100 obviously being a better rating and a more sustainable company. For the cultural data, on the other hand, we use the Hofstede's cultural dimensions. And just a quick background, Hofstede worked for IBM a while ago and interviewed over 100,000 people in different countries to gather cultural insights of different countries. And here, for example, you can see he found 6 different cultural dimensions, such as power distance, individualism, masculinity, uncertainty avoidance, long-term orientation, and indulgence. And if we just take a brief look, you can see that, for example, China has a more power distant culture than, for example, Germany or the US, meaning that there is going to be a larger gap between employees and their bosses in a workplace, where, for example, a US culture might have a more flat work environment. And just to give you some more background on our screening, so we eliminated countries that had less than 30 companies, so data on the 30 companies, and those that have insufficient Hofstede data as well as insufficient HIP data. We also decided to exclude United States because its large data set was dominating cultural ranks. But nevertheless, we have a lot of countries in the research. So from 2016, we ended up with 28 countries up to 2020 with 38 countries, which also indicates that over the years, more and more recently, more companies report their ESG information, meaning that there is more data available. And same goes for the amount of companies evaluated each year, which risen from just over 5,000 to over 8,000 that we were able to evaluate each year. Now, moving on into results, and just briefly why we observed a 5-year period. The reason for that is that before 2016, there is not as much data available, but we were fortunate enough to get at least 5-year data, which is still a sufficient snapshot in time that perhaps ignores some fluctuation, but gives us a very, very solid picture of financial performance. And when we look at the results, I know that this might be sort of challenging to look without any background, but I would encourage you to just think and look at the colors here. The green color, which indicates outperformance. So the light green from 0 to 5%, and the dark green for over than 5% compared to the main indices in the main countries, meaning that we evaluated companies' abnormal returns compared to their main indices. So, for example, in the US, in that case, that would be S&P 500 and how those companies perform compared to S&P 500. And we're going to have all of this summarized right now because this is way easier to digest. Out of all the HIP by Hof combinations, more than 98% of those outperformed their main indices, which is very significant. And 60% of those were at least 10% significant. We also concluded that the culture should be considered when we talk about ESG investing, and particularly those were the cultural dimensions that outperformed their country's indices the most. The first one was low power distance. meaning that there might be better returns or there were better returns observed when the relationship between subordinates and their bosses is not very distant. And maybe to paint a picture, an example of this could be a faster communication in a workplace. People not scared to share their ideas and findings with their bosses, which increases to more agile companies and faster changes towards the better. Some of the recommended HIP pillars that outperformed the best were low health, high wealth, and low trust. And let me say here that you can see the two low HIP pillars outperformed the most. Across the whole research, we found that in many cases that actually was the case, that low HIP companies outperform more than the high HIP. And you might ask yourself, why is that? And perhaps the reason for that could be that those companies just started reporting on ESG initiatives and are taking more and more changes to become a more ESG company. And for that reason, they capture more benefits, indicating a higher performance. Moving on, another culture we found that was outperforming main indices when talking about ESG investing was high individualistic culture, where employees are not as dependent on others and are expected to be more self-reliant and display initiative. Here, I think a good example to paint a picture would be a term called entrepreneurship, meaning innovation and entrepreneurship within a large organization. And so example of that could be that people are more willing to, be self-reliant and display initiatives with new projects, with new ideas, which leads to better research and development, and obviously positive change within a firm, leading to better returns. Some of the recommended HIP focus here is medium earth, low equality, and low management. An example of countries with high individualism besides the US would be Great Britain, Sweden, and Australia. And then lastly, the culture that we saw the better returns when we talk about ESG investing is high indulgent culture, where there is some gratification allowed and where work-life balance is more prevalent. So example of this would be that the employees that feel more satisfied with their life and work-life balance are going to be more productive, leading to better performance of a company. And some countries that have high IVR or indulgence are Mexico, Sweden, and New Zealand. The recommended HIP focus for that would be low wealth, low earth, and low management. And just to conclude this briefly before we move on to the Q&A or additional conversation, I think it's important to remember, if you want to take just 3 things out of this presentation, that the majority of HIP by HOF combinations outperform their main indices. Regardless if that was low HIP or high HIP score, all of the HIP scores generally outperform the main indices, meaning that a company is showing at least some initiative to have enough data to be evaluated by HIP, or taking even more initiative, those are going to outperform. The second thing that there is obviously a lot of research to be done further. We have already got some feedback and will in the future research include alphas to show risk-adjusted returns, but we are also considering thinking and looking at the age of the companies, because there might be a correlation of older companies being more true to their national cultures compared to our newer companies that are more global. And thirdly, to leave you with sort of saying that doing good and financially well for companies can go hand in hand. We live in an environment where we see a lot of people and organizations talking bad or down on ESG and impact investing, but this research is just part of this spreading the message that we can impact our society, our people, our environment, and at the same time do financially well. At this point, I'd like to thank you for your attention. Dr. Sardy, if you want to add anything.
Hey, thanks. Great job, Manny. What I was going to say is, yeah, one of the things I don't want to be, I want to be clear about this, and I kind of said this again in the comments, but in almost every single case, when you look at HIP by Hofstede, every single, almost every, and there were very, very few examples of this, where the HIP firms not only outperformed their index, but outperformed it by, in many cases, a significant amount. And we've been working on the idea of what might be going on within these firms. So one of the things that we were going to look at is internally what's going on with these companies. We have some theories about it, and it may come down to, in the early stages when a company is first getting involved in ESG-related activities, part of what they're doing is they're wringing out a lot of slack that's in the organization. So it's much easier for a firm that's not been doing anything to find opportunities to generate profit. And we often find, even in the median case, that again, those firms are doing very, very well. But once you get to the high end, what you may find is that now those firms have either grown quite significantly, or more importantly, they've squeezed a lot of whatever slack they've had out of the organization. They operate pretty effectively now under whatever ESG conditions they've got. And as a result, they've kind of settled into a pattern. And so there may be not as much of an opportunity to squeeze even more out of the firm. The other element that I would throw in there is a lot of the data analytics we had kind of ended during, the sort of slightly post-COVID period. And so that does throw a little bit of a, slight differential in the works. I mean, you've seen that green jobs and green companies have done better during COVID than most during that period of time. And I also wanted to add that we left out the US-based firms largely because that was, skewing our data in the direction of what the United States kind of, because I think that was a large number of the firms that were in there. That said, I think there were a lot of interesting insights that we got in terms of behavior of individuals within each country. And Hofstede does those kinds of rankings. And you could, unfortunately, when you start putting them all together, it muddies the waters when you have some companies which might be, for example, high in masculinity, with some countries that, might be higher in other areas, but lower in masculinity. But we did actually see some very interesting results. And so the work is not done, even though this is a published piece of work. It continues on, and we dig deeper as we, sort of peel the onion to try to figure out what is actually going on at various levels of, of each of these firms to get a better picture of why. The other thing, and I'd mentioned this before, we live in a state which, unfortunately suffers from the, bad behavior of some of its leadership, which believes that anything that deals with ESG should be outlawed. I mean, it's
You're talking about the state of Florida, where
yes,
Rollins
that's correct.
College is based, right?
And so unfortunately, what that means is you have a lot of people that are making recommendations and decisions without data. And unfortunately, that seems to be a lot more common these days than one would expect. But what our findings showed is that if you are looking at ESG, your performance is going to be better. And you're going to do a lot better. These companies generally tend to do better than the rest of their index. And most of these firms came out of their national indices. So if you kind of did the analytics, you said they're outperforming their index. What does that tell you about the other firms that were not tracking that data that were also in that index? Clearly, they were underperforming their index. So it brings up the issue of how does that impact results? And the impacts are quite significant. So I don't know. I'll leave it open to questions at that point.
All right, so welcome any questions in the chat box or in the question box. I'll kick it off and continue to curate the conversation here. And Nigel, I'm sure, will jump in as well with questions. So there were 28 countries that at the beginning and 38 at the end. Was there anything you observed about clusters of, people have sort of shorthand for countries, Western countries versus Eastern countries, continental differences? Sometimes in the happiness index, you'll see that Eastern European countries are not as happy, and it's like flash the Mexican flag for indulgence, where Latin countries tend to have a higher quality of a happiness level. So, and then there's the, what used to be called first world, second world, third world, but more developed versus less developed countries. Were there any trends in any of those clusters, or any new clusters you observed?
Well, I think Matej was showing like some of the countries which seem to have the highest relationship under some of those factors. And you do find that they're more oriented towards Western. And part of the dilemma is that when you look around the world, you find, for example, in the Middle East, a lot of those Hofstede variables don't or aren't tracked. And when you go to some other parts of the world, while they may have some tracking for Hofstede data, there just aren't enough firms in those indices. So what you end up with is European, obviously, a lot more countries with larger sets of data that will give you, many more companies to do the analytics with. And so we did see a lot of, similar patterns. You do see certain kinds of, I think, Hofstede values working together when you're dealing with, say, for example, Latin countries, and the performance that you see with those. And also with European countries, there's a little bit more clustering from that perspective as well. Once again, of course, the United States staying out of it means that you get a little bit more visibility of smaller countries around the world than you would normally, because the U.S. with thousands of companies that are tracked can sometimes be more than all of the companies put together that you have in the index. So I think that's part of what we were looking at. So I'm not sure if that answered what you were getting at.
No, that's super helpful. I'm sure there's lots to dig into. Okay, questions are flowing in. So just one more context question. We covered are the Hofstede categories, are there just 5 categories with many questions under each one? Is that 5 is the framework?
Yeah, I
It's
mean,
6.
Hofstede's, yeah, go ahead.
It's 6 of them, yeah.
6, okay.
So
So
I think,
distance between levels, like hierarchical versus collaborative, there seem to be distinctions. There are distinctions around sort of balance of work life and more versus less. I saw that some of them, like Germany and Denmark, they're strong labor union countries where also labor unions are on the boards of those companies. Did that persist beyond those 2 countries, beyond Denmark and Germany? Was that a fair observation? Or
yeah, I mean, I think you do see that in countries where there are connections, along the ones that you highlighted. I think getting back to some of what you were saying, we do see relationships when you're starting to get into some of the details about what countries have similar patterns. And as you saw from Matej's earlier slide, when you look at where regulation is, you see there's a lot more attention to it in Europe. In the United States, there's a lot of pushback, right? I mean, we're seeing across the board a lot of folks trying to roll back a lot of the ESG initiatives that are going on in the country. And the argument is, oh, it doesn't really work. But what we're seeing is that the culture actually shows you around the world that Europe, for example, there's a lot more culture that supports doing this. Now, when you get back to the Hofstede cultures, there's another study I've done which also looked at international mindsets. And so that on the one hand, you deal with cultures. On the other hand, you deal with mindset. What is the mindset of people from different regions? And we found a similar behavior to the mindset, which is a sort of more recent innovation. But when you go back to Hofstede, what he did is he used some very interesting statistical techniques with lots of questions that were thrown to people in different countries to see how did they respond. And then using a sort of factor analytic approach, sort of narrowed it down to his definition of what does it mean to be American? What does it mean to be British? What does it mean to be, for example, French? And then those characteristics tend to show up in some of the patterns of behavior. But one of the things that I think may be an interesting insight into all of this is as the world becomes more globalized and as a lot more of the newer companies become faster in terms of their communications, faster in terms of their agility and the way they behave, you're starting to see a lot more convergence in the behavior of a lot of the newer companies. And so some of the differences, that was why Matej alluded to the idea that we're looking at age, because we suspect, and we haven't actually tested it yet, that when you look at the older line companies that have been around for 20 or more years, that you start to see different patterns of behavior. In other words, they might be a little bit more we'll say fixed on what might be considered a more specific cultural mentality. And when you're dealing with newer companies that are 10 to 15 years in age, you're actually seeing companies that are more global in their view, more open in their mindset towards ESG, and play a very different role. So that might be getting at some of what I think you were asking, right?
And I might just come back to something you were saying before or build on it about cultural antipathy towards ESG as a concept in some places. And I spent a bunch of time in Australia, and Australia's been through a version of that. That's happily changed in recent times. And I always think it's very helpful to follow the money, exactly as you've done in this research. And so it's interesting to look at the BNEF data in terms of the amount of money that's being invested. And this is the trajectory in terms of total investment in the energy transformation, now a bit more than $1 trillion. What's really interesting is this: who's building the factories? And guess what? It's almost all China. So China China, obviously, centrally directed economy, albeit one where most of the economy is thoroughly capitalist, with 20% driven by the state and the rest encouraged to follow along, has been amazingly effective at putting in place the investment in infrastructure to manufacture the future, and is making its economy stronger as a result. And of course, economics is driving this in other places too. And we've probably all seen in the last few days that Texas will overtake California for the level of installation of solar PV by I think May. So this is a fascinating tension between quasi-religious likes or dislikes for certain things versus the economics that applies, versus, for that matter, what do people care about? Because the other thing to wind in here is, as part of the Earth for All work, we did a big survey across the whole OECD, and essentially in every one of those countries, 70% plus of the population supports significant action on climate change. So it's a vote winner.
Yeah, and I would kind of add to that. So China's got an interesting trajectory, because in my last visit to China, I was absolutely amazed at the sheer volume of things. Like, you drive through sections of the Gobi Desert, and there would be wind farms literally stretching across the horizon. You literally look as far as you could see, and there would be massive wind farms. And you go to other places, you'd see solar installations. And part of that was driven by the fact that the pollution rates in China were off the charts. I mean, if you were living in Shanghai or Beijing or any of the major cities in China, which, by the way, have populations that are unfathomable, 26, 27 million people in one city, the pollution levels were off the charts. And as a result, the death rates related to pollution would have been epidemic levels had they been in the West, right? So I think what you're getting is the pushback of people in China who, there are times where the government does listen to them and will try to do something about it, because given that China is, in many cases, 70 or 80% of furniture production, 70 or 80% of toy production, and you can go down the list, and they dominate in so many different areas because of the SOEs, the state-owned enterprises, and the government-private partnerships, that the end result is, they are the ones that are putting the money into it. They recognize the need for it, and they recognize that the country is just, there's too many issues with pollution that if they don't address it, they're just killing their own population at too rapid a pace, and they must do something about it. Whereas you go to the West, for example, in the United States, for many years, we really attacked the issue of pollution. So I think back to the 60s and the 70s, when rivers in the United States were so, like, I think the Schuylkill River in Pennsylvania caught on fire at one point because of all the toxic stuff that was in the river. Today, there are fish swimming in the river, and everything's, much, much better than it was, even the East River in New York City. So I think we've come so far away from that we've lost track of how easy it is to kind of slide back into that area. And I think you do get people in the West who sort of say, well, do we really need to do this? Is this really necessary? But clearly the marriage between, if you are just one of those investors who says, I don't really care about this stuff, I just want to do well, I want my portfolio to do well. And the disconnect is that people think, well, my portfolio would do well, so I don't need to worry about this. It actually turns out, no, they're actually directly related. If you're buying into the companies that are doing the right thing, they're also going to do well. And so anyone who sort of thinks, no, it's a disconnected issue, is not really paying attention to facts. And if you're going to push the issue of investing in companies that aren't paying attention to ESG, as there are those who would like to say, oh, it's a woke concept, which I find very kind of outrageous, is really just dismissing, the reality of what's going on, which is, as we showed, fantastic returns, outperforming virtually, every index that we looked at worldwide. So why in the world would you be focused on investing in the companies that are going to underperform the index and ruin the environment and, hurt the people they're working with, their stakeholders, and, have terrible corporate governance, when you could do much better by picking the companies that are doing all the right things? And I don't know if that gets back to what you were saying, but
yeah.
If I may
to
add
follow up,
something.
yeah, go ahead, Matej.
Yeah,
and then
part of this, and going back to the clusters that you mentioned, Paul, could be attributed to a specific Hofstede cultural factor, which is long-term orientation. And so, for example, China has a score of 87, very high. Germany, like a large representation of Europe, has 83. On the other side, we have US with a score of 26, which is one of the lowest, meaning that they're more short-term oriented. And so having European unions putting a lot of regulations in place, which is obviously long-term thinking, at the same time, China surpassing US in the sustainable funds inflows. And as we just saw, this very interesting and insightful graphic that they're building the most of the factories for renewable energy shows that long-term orientation could have some impact on how different cultures are now moving towards the new world where we have to think about sustainability and ESG.
Yeah,
right, so
I think there was a wonderful comment. I think it was, I'm not sure if I'm attributing correctly to Deng Xiaoping, when someone had kind of approached him and said, you know, what do you think about democracy in the West? And his response was, the jury's still out on it, because, you know, from the Chinese perspective, they have such a long view of things that the whole rise of democracy in the West is still a relatively short experiment as far as they're concerned. So.
okay, so were there any factors that dealt with entrepreneurship? That's one of the questions from the audience. And are there cultural factors that specifically focus on diversity? In the US, being a melting pot, there's many different immigrants that blend together. But in, like, I worked in Thailand, for example, and so there's diversity in some cases of some religion and of some ethnic groups, but it's sort of, majority, majority ethnicity. So how did diversity, either of gender or ethnicity, you mentioned age earlier, play out in the data? And was there anything about entrepreneurship of taking that initiative?
I can tackle the first one about entrepreneurship, and I think we mentioned that individualism is a really good Hofstede cultural factor when we talk about entrepreneurship, because countries that score really high in that are United States, United Kingdom, perhaps even Israel, which have more cases of entrepreneurship of large companies. And this is sort of tied to entrepreneurship as well, but is seen with the internal innovation at a larger firm. So I would definitely say individualism is a good proxy for that.
Yeah, and I think when you get to the cultural issue, you also get to that collectivism as well, which is, some societies more collectivist, and it gets to some of what you were saying in Asia. And collectivist cultures were a little weaker in some areas, and individualists were a little bit stronger in others. So when you're looking at, Hofstede, when you deal with, I think some of the other factors, for example, like masculinity shows up a bit in some of the data as well. And so masculinity is, sort of, male-dominated cultures. And you find that in some countries, that actually has the opposite effect in terms of the productivity of the companies. Now, getting back to what Matej was saying about entrepreneurship. So remember, we're primarily looking at corporations, right? So when you look at innovation within the corporation, or, some of that self-motivation or self-direction, we're not looking at, startups here. We're particularly looking at companies that exist. So if they're being innovative in there, the end result is it's leading to better outcomes. And you can connect this to power distance, right? So essentially the low power distance companies are outperforming, and they're also high individualist. So what you're really saying is the executives of the companies are giving their employees a chance to really run with ideas, to really sort of make things happen. They're giving them the support they need. And the end result is that's leading to better performance. So while we don't actually have a measure of, okay, what is this company doing with regard to entrepreneurship, we do see those two corresponding results as pointing in that direction. If that, I think, gets to some of what you were asking about.
Understand. Clarifying question. The Hofstede Index is just for countries?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. I mean,
can it be applied inside a company? Could you do a Hofstede
absolutely.
profile inside companies? Have they gone down that road at all?
So there's a little experiment I used to do with my classes, which was pretty entertaining, is we would look at the cultural dimensions, and then we would have the students kind of look backwards at their cultural upbringing. Where were they originally from? And what you would find, which was absolutely fascinating, is that even if a student had come from, it was 2 or 3 generations in the United States, that ironically their cultural background played a very big role in their behavior. And, it might be 2 or 3 generations out, but it was still playing a role in the United States, which is very much a melting pot. And it was fascinating for the students to recognize that, you know, for example, if they looked at things like Myers-Briggs, which was another study which looked at, you know, how people behave and what type of person they were, and then compared it with their Hofstede scores, you saw that a student who might have, you know, descended from a German immigrant 2 or 3 generations back still demonstrated the Hofstede cultural dimensions of a German immigrant. And someone who come from a, you know, Indian background from India would have actually generated results that suggest they still had the same backgrounds 2 or 3 generations out. So it does play a role individually. And I think within a company, you would have some very interesting outcomes, because quite often in companies, you have a very broad range of people. But when you know, and I've seen this when companies are very mono-focused, and I've seen, it's sad to say, companies which only hire people that are identical, you don't necessarily get a lot of that creative diversity of thought, which opens the door to you know, newer innovations and newer opportunities, which might lead to better outcomes down the road.
All right. One of the things you didn't say explicitly, but I think is there implicitly, so just wanted to reconfirm, the outperformance of many of these segments is essentially coming from companies that report versus companies that don't report. So there's like a transparency correlation.
Yeah.
Is that a fair interpretation?
Absolutely, because, you know, let's imagine for a moment all we've looked at were HIP scored companies. And I think all HIP does is look at companies that are actually reporting data. And in the case that you had a company that reports very, very little data, as in sub 5%, they weren't included. And what that also leaves out is firms that don't report anything. So if they're not being transparent and they're not, you know, reporting anything, and even though there are, you know, even though you have your limited pillars, beneath each one of those pillars are lots of data points. It's not just, oh, we gathered one little bit of information. There could be, what, 20 or 30 different data points going into each pillar. So you've got hundreds of data points going into the pillars. And this is a lot of information to be collecting on all these different firms. What it means is that these other firms not included, they're not reporting any of this. They're not putting any of it out there for it to be counted. And there's probably good reason. One, they don't want anyone to know, because possibly a lot of what the answers would be pretty negative. Two, they're unwilling to devote the resources because they don't believe that it matters. And I mean, what we've seen is that companies that devote the resources invariably find out good things about it, and it leads to better performance. What was it? DuPont was the company that was the funny story about them polluting for so long, and all the environmentalists who'd gone after them for so many years got nowhere. And then someone reported to them, hey, have you thought of reclaiming all those chemicals that you're dumping into the rivers and streams? Because I think you could sell them. And they did a quick analysis on it, realized that there was a lot of money flying out the door every day that they were just dumping into the rivers and streams, captured all the stuff and sold it. And they, at the same time, found out that they were less of a polluter and that they made a lot more money in the process. And it's just a, you know, one anecdotal example, but I think the story goes across the board. You can look at company after company that is doing this kind of stuff. But if they're not reporting it, there's a pretty good chance that they're not doing anything, which is why they're not doing the reporting.
Got it. Another question is, is there any connection between the high distance, low distance companies and the wage equality or inequality? So did it show up, like, say, in the wealth pillar, where high distance versus low distance had a distinction?
Well, I think, Matej, you can put it back up there, but I think there is. And I think, you know, we know that in the United States that there is a huge distance in terms of wages, right? I mean, you'll find for a lot of companies, probably not amongst the ones who are reporting. So when you look at wealth here, what we're seeing is, yeah, in the low power distance, it was definitely significant. And in the medium power distance with regard to wealth, or I would say in the high power distance, medium wealth was also significant, but also down at the low end for wealth and low power distance, it would be significant. So there's, in low power distance and low wealth, what you're probably looking at is a firm where, you know, hey, we're all sharing in the burden. We all agree that we're not necessarily going to get individually wealthy, but maybe collectively we'll do better off, I think would be one of the things that you might see. And you'll see also down there, there's a correlation between low power distance and high equality. So you might find in those companies where you're looking at low power distance, you see significance in, low wealth. They're willing to take a little bit of a break on everybody trying to get ahead on the earnings. And you're also seeing on the equality side, there's lower equality, but you're also seeing that, high power distance, high equality, which is, a little bit of an odd relationship. Whereas the differential in returns is, still pretty big on the low power distance side, specifically in the, in the dichotomy of high and low. So you kind of, what we're seeing is there's a sort of muddying of the waters between, let's say, companies that are doing low power distance and high wealth, and low power distance and low wealth, right? So arguably two different groups in terms of what's going on. The one group enriching everyone, and the other group is not doing as good job of spreading the wealth, but at the same time, both are significant and both are fairly close in terms of the outperformance of the index. Is that?
Got it. Okay. And we'll put the link to the paper in the chat one more time so you can read it, understand the cultural factors, see some of the correlations, follow up with questions. Nigel, any questions before we wrap up?
I don't think so. I think for me, that's just been absolutely fascinating, and so many challenges lie ahead. And part of the answer is that religious beliefs don't necessarily help you. Dealing with objective facts is incredibly persuasive in figuring out not just what to do and how to do it, but what is going to be most profitable. Because one of the big underlying themes to this is the smart investors are those that are investing in the future, which is what energy is about, and industrial decarbonization and regenerative agriculture. And if you're betting all your money on the past, it's a pretty dangerous game. There's not many people that became billionaires through investing in the past.
Yeah.
Right. All right, so we'll wrap it up here. I want to thank Matej Susec and Dr. Marc Sardy. Thanks for your deep research. Thanks for getting into the DNA of sustainability, how it might vary by country, and that companies who are doing something and reporting it, that is an indicator of positive progress, and in this case seems to align with financial outperformance. So that's super instructive. That aligns with our philosophy. There are other data or ratings firms that estimate things and fill in the blanks. We do not believe in that. We believe either you report it or you don't, because there's, we don't want to give a failing student a C grade, and A students won't stand up for a C grade either. So, so thanks for this in-depth research. Encourage everybody to read it. Look forward to the forthcoming research, and appreciate our collaboration here. So, and Matej, thanks very much for your podcast on impact investing. So I encourage everybody to listen to Matej's podcast, over 20 episodes now. And so on behalf of everybody, Amir Khaleghi, thanks for the Green Jobs Report, our producer, Nick Gower in the background, and my co-host Nigel Lake. We do the ESGX at least monthly, so we'll look forward to seeing you next month, and sometimes more than monthly. So if you have ideas or panelists that you want to suggest, please let us know, because we want to bring more sustainability to the world, higher impact, and of course, the potential for more profit for your portfolios. So thanks again, everybody. Look in the chat for Matej's podcast, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time on ESGX.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all very
Very
much.
much.